village has always been the basic social unit in the countryside. Within living memory, it was where you lived and worked, told stories, and passed on customs to your children. In Kent, the Garden of England, village life revolved around the orchards and woods. In the South Wales valleys, coal mining took over the traditional agricultural way of life. But now, great changes are afoot in the village, dramatically altering its work and pattern of settlement, and the outlook of those who live there.
In the old days, the village was the centre of the universe. And it was the centre of the universe because it was impossible to get to anywhere else from Charlesfield. Now, the village at that time, it had its own pace of life. It was horses and carts and farm carts. It was a peaceful, quiet way of life. Old men would stop and talk over fences to other old men. Chickens would scratch for grit at the sides of the lanes, the roads in the middle of the village.
I cannot imagine I will ever live anywhere except in a village. My father was a country parson in Kent, my grandfather was as well, and I had the privilege later, many years later, of having my own parishes in Kent.
The village itself had all the things that Kentish villages should have. It had a church and a chapel. It had a small primary school. It had 3 or maybe even 4 duck ponds.
The village was a very friendly little community. There were 2 grocery shops and a tiny little village telephone exchange where the telephone operator would say, well, it's no use ringing him, he's gone out. So that was a great help.
There was a saddlery which made saddles, harnesses, repaired shoes.
Village blacksmith, it was a sort of local parliament. Everything was settled there.
There was a village shop that was a wonderland. It was run by a man and his wife and an elderly woman assistant who all bickered non-stop all the time. The shop had all the old-fashioned groceries on one side when you went in. It had sides of bacon hanging up, it had cheeses everywhere. It had a bacon slicer that was in fact the pride of the owner.
The village pub that no lady went into because it was very much spit and sawdust, you know, the spittoons on the floor, and on the bar in there was always pickled eggs. There always seemed to be 3 of them floating in vinegar, and my brothers used to call them Faith, Hope and Charity because they reckoned that they'd been there for years.
Once upon a time, the life of every village was tied up very much with the farming community and the prosperity of farming. People went hop picking and cherry picking and apple picking, and this money then generated further capital into the villages, and the villages were based on the farms.
Village life wasn't just based on the farm, it was tangled up with the land itself, driven by its soil, seasons, harvests and occasional disasters. The village was sharply aware of its boundaries too. Its ancestral road system of back lanes and field paths was an internal one, like a network of blood vessels, and only occasionally burrowed into the outside world. And round it circulated the lifeblood of the village, each crop in some way feeding the next. Apples on the table, sheep in the orchard, spent fruit and hops spread on the fields, hop poles cut from the woods, timber and Wealden clay building the houses. It was this self-sufficient cycle that gave each village its special character.
Kent is a garden often described as the Garden of England. For from its lush green fields and rich soil, centuries of harvests have found their way to London and markets all over the world. From earliest times, it has been renowned for its fruit and crops, immortalized in the words of Charles Dickens, Kent, sir, everybody knows Kent. Apples, cherries, hops, and women.
On the other side of Britain, in the valleys of South Wales, the land was also being harvested, but in a way that left deep scars. It happened in not much more than 4 generations. A landscape and a culture were rebuilt, exploited, run down, and now have to find a new identity for themselves. A century ago, the South Wales valleys were pockets of pasture land, running with sheep and dotted with oak woods. Mining changed them utterly into landscapes of industrial dereliction. It destroyed many of the people too, but not their fondness for their home countryside and communities, which is reflected in their passion for music and education and nature, as well as pride in their work. It's a pride that has seen the valleys through great disasters and the end of mining itself. Life goes on. The pit ponies take tourists for rides. The spoil heaps sprout trees. And ex-miners, Busty Mason and Ivor England, prepare to guide another party of tourists around the mining museum that was once their workplace. They will be our guides too on this journey through the valley's history.
Lewis Mercer was a pit of 1,000 men. A pit that would be working this time of the day, would be working that headgear now, the sheaves now would be winding and the coal would be coming up the pit, and the noise of engines pulling empties up, taking full ones down to Cardiff and things like that. See, well that's gone forever, and I think everybody's seen this great change and haven't come to terms with it. Many people are still, bemused by it all, that everything has happened so suddenly, but it's gone. And what remains now is a place to tell the story of the Rhondda.
But normally this would be a very dangerous, dusty place to work. Now, the roof supports you see...
Well, when I was a kid, if you were standing here, you see smoke belching out from all the houses here, There'd be first thing in the morning when everybody's lighting the fire, there'd be just a haze of smoke along here. You wouldn't see a thing, And you'd see about 3 or 4 coal mines working, and all the coal powered boilers they had, for the steam to run the winders, that'd be belching up, and you'd hear a sound, a thud, like a sound of industry, really,
We never knew anything else, and we just accepted the fact that we were coal mining people, and the valley was there for coal mining. For instance, there was a ventilator fan in one of the works, one of the mines close to where I lived, which chuffed away night and day non-stop, a steam engine noise. I would imagine it would drive me to distraction.
Back in Kent, the background noise was more harmonious.
May Day was celebrated in villages with maypole dancing, or the little girl would be Queen of the May, and all the other children would dress up.
The May Queen was elected out of all the young ladies of the village. It was, if you like, a sort of a beauty contest, although not particularly so. The girl with the most personality could well have been the May Queen. The village was in fact essentially very much an agricultural setup. Everybody in the village appreciated the seasons. This was why the May celebrations took place.
This is some old family film of my father taking me as a baby into the orchard at blossom time. It's probably quite traditional in this area, and as a parent it's something that I've also chosen to do. The fragrance is so strong that it's overpowering, and it's something you just wouldn't want your children to miss.
In in those days, Kent really earned its name as the Garden of England because there were all the orchards, the apple orchards, the cherry orchards, and then you've got the hop fields. It was a beautiful, beautiful place.
All through there, as far as the eye can see, was cherries, right up into the Scuddington Wood. There was just, I think it was just this one bit of apples here what had cut it out. This was all cherries right through here. Beautiful place it was, beautiful. You virtually came up an avenue, both sides of this road. You imagine these trees here and blossom all the way around it. People came from miles around to see it.
In contrast to the blossom-ringed countryside of Kent, the South Wales mining valleys were wreathed in smoke and grime.
The coal from this area was famous for use in naval ships, steam coal, excellent type of coal. When that demand fell off, of course, they've got to find other uses, and it was found that it was an excellent coal for making furnaceite. Furnaceite in itself was a lovely product for people who didn't have to live with this manufacture. It was great in stoves and clothes appliances. It burned with a cheerful glow and a slight blue flame. It burned away to an ash, and it was a good product. But unfortunately, although it was a smokeless fuel, it is only smokeless by imposing upon us a terrible burden of pollution and smoke and grime and filth.
It affected the trees very badly, and round about 1955, I think it was, they'd been going about 10 years, there was a bore made into the wood, and you know the annular rings in the trees, and counting back, you could see quite accurately when the furnaceite really got going, because the annular rings got smaller and smaller and smaller as the fallout, the dust fallout and the sulphur affected the leaves. They made less food, they made less wood, they grew less, and gradually, of course, a lot of them died. The effect on the wildlife was unreckoned at all at that time, but trees being the bottom of the food chain, it affected the insect life, and that affected the bird life, that would have affected the small mammals, and wildlife generally was very sparse for quite a long time around here.
But in the fertile orchards of Kent, wildlife flourished.
When I was a child, there were a lot more bullfinches than there are now. It's a very pretty bird, very pretty, especially the male, but unfortunately 2 bullfinches can strip, and I mean strip, a tree in 20 minutes completely. So therefore, a pretty bird suddenly becomes a tremendous pest and would destroy your livelihood. My father would have had a man going round in the early part of the spring trying to shoot the bullfinch. They were then trapped in cages, and what's happened over the years is that the number of bullfinches has gone down, so perhaps we're just not quite so aggressive towards them. But we try now to use cotton and other materials to actually put them off. We found that that works just as well and keeps them out of the orchard, because they fly into it, it disrupts them, and then they go somewhere else.
The really old orchards, they was not very productive from the farmer's point of view, but there was lovely old apple trees with holes in them, and in those days I remember we had a lovely bird called a wryneck nesting there. Now the wrynecks absolutely disappeared from this part of the world. It was right on the edge of its range. It's still in Europe, and we used to call them the snake birds because we'd climb up to the nest and we'd look inside and they'd hiss at us. You know, it was really lovely seeing them. I haven't seen a wryneck now for what, 15 to 20 years.
The loss of these old ragged orchards is a tragedy. They were often as rich in wildlife as woods, draped with mistletoe and lichen and carpeted with meadow flowers. And like the village pond, they were paradises for children, who in their tangled corners had the freedom to discover natural history and something about their own natures.
if you had a jam jar and a piece of string, and were brave enough to lean out over the old ash tree, you could go hunting monsters in that pond. Huge newts. They looked huge behind the glass. They looked like prehistoric monsters.
Ponds were things to be fallen into, to be slid on in the winter until the ice started to break. It was always a challenge who would stay on the longest until the ice went. You would lay in the grass by ponds and look at the water boatmen and the tadpoles and the newts. And we played by ponds in the hour that it took us to get to school and the hour that it took us to get back. But children don't play in and around them anymore. The world is different now. People can't let their children play by ponds. These days, everybody goes and collects their children, so a great slice of childhood life has gone.
In Wales, the mining families looked out and up for their inspiration, to the green moors and the fresh air of the hills.
As you got on top of the mountains, you leave that sign behind you, you know, and you pick up other sounds like, you know, like birds and that, you know, which you wouldn't hear normally in the valleys, you know. Cracking birds. I mean, we didn't know what they were as kids, but the old miners would point them out. You know, he said there's a lapwing going over that.
There have always been lapwings and larks in the Welsh valleys, especially in the green oases on top of the hills. I wouldn't mind betting it was a Rhondda man who 500 years ago wrote The Mansion of the Woods. They have sent forth their cry, the loquacious lads. Yesterday they heard it under the green trees, pure and church-like. The linnet from the brake, the pure-toned thrush, sweet rascal. The woodlark soaring wantonly, catching the skylark's tune, singing, scattering so much fancy, so gay, so fresh, the accent of true passion. I think there's some poetic justice in the way skylarks are increasing in these once ruined landscapes, just when they're vanishing from the intensive farmland of the lowlands. And how heartening that a grandfather can see again the birds he saw as a boy and share the experience with his grandchildren.
Low down here, look, just over your head, look.
I've been here, there, and just about everywhere bird watching. I've toured the Mediterranean, all over Britain. Regardless of what people might say, I'm quite happy to believe in the Rhondda.
Yeah, you can see them flashing white. Look, are they turning?
I'm a naturalist by instinct. I'm not a tick hunter. So when you've got these birds getting in the cars, they go and chase this, they go and chase that. There's enough going on about me to keep me going 52 weeks a year. When I was a boy and a young man, the tips here was dominated the landscape.
The locals, never short of a sense of humour, nicknamed these heaps the Alps. But there was a more sinister irony in the name of one of the villages, Mountain Ash, named after the rowan tree that was supposed to bring good luck.
We're on a tip overlooking Mountain Ash. And when I was a child, we used to spend our time in the summer in making slides. We used to bring up old tin trays and pieces of cardboard, and we'd go whizzing down the slopes at breakneck speed.
Well, if I sound shocked, I am shocked, because the news from here is much grimmer than was at first thought. First official figures of the people missing was given, and the total number of children missing here is officially put at 163. There were 254 children in the school when the mountain moved. It came down, one teacher told me, in a black mass.
Oh dear. I mean, that still moves one, doesn't it? Sorry. ordinary shopping in Mountain Ash, and I went into the newsagents, and they said there's been a terrible tip slip in Aberfan, and a lot of children are killed. And you know, my children were young then, and your heart turns over. Came home, there it was on all the news bulletins. And I suppose, like everybody in South Wales, your instinct was to go and help.
God almighty, when we saw what had happened, the whole tip had covered the school and children had died in that school. Well, many of my mates went over and they said, you know, they just didn't stand in earth, and people were trying to scrabble at the store and try, you know, through exasperation, through panic, trying to get it there, but it was too bad, you know, it's too late.
Tipping had gone on willy-nilly. A favourite ploy of the coal board, if anyone objected to a new tip being set out upon the mountainside, was to say, oh, well, if we can't have the tip, we'll have to close the colliery. And of course, straight away, everybody capitulated and said, oh, go on then, have your tip.
Making the spoiled tip safe after Aberfan became almost an act of vengeance. There was a furious rush, simply to level as many of these lowering black masses as possible. It's only more recently that any thought has been given as to how they might be reshaped.
They made sure this terrible thing couldn't happen again. They graded all the colliery tips. So if you look around you here now, it's hardly noticeable where mountain starts and coal tip ends, like, you know, it's graded now all into the background.
And so, for the third time this century, the valley landscapes were remodelled. The second time was when they were draped with conifers in the 20s and 30s to supply homegrown pit props. There's a legend that Lloyd George said, "We'll be able to roll the timber down the hillside to the mines."
The valley is totally different now from what it was when I was a boy. We roamed these hills. There wasn't a tree in sight. I worked in this area planting trees. Of course, they're felling now, but planting trees in those days back in the early 50s, 60s. And I planted quite a few trees in this area and further down the valley as well, over in Bryn and down over in Tonmawr.
On the surface, these bare Rhondda hillsides were a sensible place for conifer plantations. Forestry provided jobs and a use for the apparently barren land. Yet it aroused mixed feelings locally, the sense of a foreign occupation of what had once been open moorland, and a veil, perhaps, across the hard realities of mining.
It was a bad thing for us, really, as kids, because it stopped our access to the mountains, you know. And they employed wardens and commission workers, you know, and they would turf us out of the forest, you know. Routes we had taken as years, you know, we thought it was all right, really, you know. But there was a few benefits from the forest, you know. Of course, they created these lovely Christmas trees, you know. And I don't think nobody in the Rhondda, not living next to the forest, you ever bought a Christmas tree after that, you know.
There's a sterility about the conifer forest that I find very sad. I mean, over there, that was farmland. All that part there was farmland. There's just those little bits left now. And then above the farmland was moorland. Lots of heather, lots of whin. There's a lot of grouse up there, merlin, lots of skylarks, and the ubiquitous sheep, of course. But it was very open, beautiful moorland, you know, which is praised in Scotland and Yorkshire, and they don't realise that we had so much of it in South Wales.
All the area that you see in the foreground here is now covered with bracken. But in my time, in the summer, there would be banks of heather. Indeed, if I were to think back on a memory which most recalls my summer holidays in my childhood, it would be the beautiful purple bloom of the wimberries.
There'd be dozens of us up here for days on end. We'd bring sandwiches and pop, and we'd be picking wimberries all the time. Oh, they make marvellous tart. But we used to go home with our mouths and our hands all covered, our clothes all covered with this purpley juice, because we used to be eating half of them, but we used to be in an awful mess. They are very, very juicy. You can imagine the difficulty our mothers had to try and get our clothes clean after this.
All right, kids? Take your time now. Come on. Watch you don't fall in the stream.
Coming from the top and then they join the sea.
Okay? No joke being in there, was it? Now, see that forest we just came out, how dark it was in there, and you couldn't walk about at all. Yeah. When I was a boy, see this open woods here? It's oak wood, isn't it? Yeah. When I was, just like you are now, boys, I came up here bird nesting. Because this wood have always been here. And see how open it is? You can walk about it and no trouble at all. Look. See the light getting through? See all the small trees coming up on their own? That's why they put an oak wood, see? Lots of things live in there. It supplies most of the food that things want in the way of insects, birds, you name it, they feed it in there. Like. They don't just hide in there, they actually live in there. That's the difference, see? They hide in the fir forest, they don't live there, they only hide there. They come here and they actually live here.
When you're walking along sometimes in the fairly dense conifer blocks, which are typical of some of the older blocks, now the planting's a little bit more open, we get these big flocks of crossbills coming over. And they're very vocal, you know, you get this sort of cheep, cheep, cheep. You heard a few, the beginning of the flock coming over. And some of these flocks can number perhaps 100, 200, even 300 birds. And to be sitting in the middle of these conifers with this happening around you, these birds just descending on you, is again a really, it's an honoured experience really to be there.
The new clearings have begun to be colonised those mysterious and exotic birds, nightjars, that arrive here from Africa in May. On midsummer dusks, the Rhondda hills have started to echo with their hypnotic chirrings. And the Forest Authority is now adjusting its felling plans to meet the needs of nesting nightjars. I like the thought of them gracing an area where darkness has had so many less pleasant meanings. Birds are not quite so welcome with the cherry farmers of Kent.
Colour. Colour attracts the birds. You won't see it while they're green, but when they colour up, you'll know where the birds are. They take the first pick, mostly blackbirds and starlings. Starlings especially. They are vulgar beasts. But there are ways we try and combat that.
My old grandfather, he used to get up about the crack of dawn with an old shotgun under his arm, and he used to patrol the orchards and bang away at the birds.
Cherries mattered to Kent. More than any other fruit, they were the county's special crop. In 1950, 15,000 tonnes were picked and sold. Today the figure is down to 3,000 tonnes. Cherries have become a luxury product, just as the orchards are becoming marginal landscapes.
I did climb up the trees, but as far as I was concerned, the birds always had the top ones. That's as far as I got. I was not a cherry picker, because to be a cherry picker, it's an art in itself.
summer, late summer, this was unbelievable because this was the time of the harvest. And whilst harvest time these days is a 2-day affair with one man on a combine harvester, in those days it sometimes went on for 2 months, because I can remember at the farthest point of my memory them cutting the corn and women plaiting straw and tying up the sheaves with plaited straw. After that they had the same cutter but with a binder on, in fact, which did exactly what it said. It bound the sheaves together. But then somebody had to go and stand these upright until they dried out into things called stooks, and stooks always fell over. And it was somebody's job to go around and restack them for a week or so. When they were dry, then they were loaded onto carts and brought into the meadow opposite the old house that I lived, where a haystack would be made. You don't see haystacks anymore now. And these would be wonderful affairs with a thatched top full of mice and rats. We, I suppose, really were wreckers when it came to haystacks, because I shudder when I think about it now, but we would actually tunnel into the bottom of a haystack and go in 8 or 9 feet and then go up in the centre of the haystack and come out at the top. And we would lay up the top there with the beano and the dandy and bottles of pop and watch the world going on.
As well as cherries to gather and hay to harvest, there were hops to pick. For the East End families who came for the hop picking, it was the toughest work of the year, but also their annual holiday. It was often difficult to draw a clear line between work and play in the countryside, even in the hardest days.
The view was fantastic because, you know, we'd never seen sheep and cows before, and it was like another world to us, you know, out the window. Vast. It seemed no end to fields and edges, and you didn't know where it began and where it ended. It was, you know, like a jungle to us, really. But sticking your head out, you got full of soot smacks, you know, from the engine, tears running down your all black faces. So by the time you got there, you was absolutely black.
We used to go to the station and collect them. My first memories in the horse and wagons, load all the gear on top, and they would come down with the little old boxes on wheels, and the whole family would come, and for a month or whatever, the whole countryside came to life more than usual.
They had their own particular huts year after year. These were awful places. These were corrugated iron with no sanitation, no water, or anything like that, but these people arrived and they had a wonderful time.
Well, you made them look nice, you know. Some of it, if you had tin huts like these, they was a bit awkward, so, you know, you've got to go in between the crevices for paper. But if you had a wooden hut, it was flat, so you could lay paper. But years ago, you never had polycell. You had paste, you know, and flour, self-raising, and the time you stuck it this end and got to that end, this end had come off. And by the time mopping was finished, it was all hanging off.
The pickers' habits weren't always to the liking of the Kent villagers.
So, well, they thought we sung going down the road because we were scared of the dark. But we used to sing because we used to annoy them. We liked to get them up out of their beds. They went to bed at 10, and we were still in the pub at 10. And we were just merry. We just used to like going home singing, fall in the ditch, and get up again and carry on. You know, but we was noisy, and they were abed, and they didn't like it.
When I first came to Kent, it was the villages were very to themselves. Londoners were not accepted.
The local shops would all have wire netting across the counters so that the stuff didn't disappear faster than they could get it on the shelves. Not that they were all likely to do that, but they had the reputation of being so, and the country people didn't trust them, quite honestly.
They used to put wire netting up 4 foot high above the counter so that you couldn't get your hand over it to pinch a bar of chocolate. But we did. There was ways and means.
9 times out of 10, in all the hop gardens or all the hop picking in Kent, it was always Mum that come down with the kids to give them an holiday, while Dad still worked at home to pay the rent.
The earliest I can remember was when I was 5, just playing around the huts and playing, you know, in the field while they were picking. I can remember being pushed in the pram up and down the hills if I cried, having things stuffed in your hand to keep you quiet, sucking, you know, bits of chocolate and things like that. It was horrible to pick as a girl because your hands got stained And if you went to eat a sandwich, it tasted in your mouth, it was vile. And it was one continuous pick, 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 you know. And when you got back to the huts of the night, you just couldn't get the stuff off.
It was a sad day. When the first machines actually appeared, it was a very sad day because previous to machines coming in, there was a lot of talk about machines, and the general consensus of opinion was that machines would never ever take over hand picking. Unfortunately they did, and it was the end of an era. You do not get the East Enders coming down, so to me, personally, it's dead, buried and finished, I'm afraid.
I think the hop industry as we used to know it is dead, unfortunately, because the commodity hops that were used to make lager and that are not worth growing anymore, really. And so hop growers have got down to a sort of producing a niche product now. And I believe there will always be hops. For instance, in East Kent, there will always be Goldings. And in this part of the world, there will be traditional varieties which are used for making English bitter, proper. So I think there will be a limited acreage. I don't think it's dead, but I think it is hanging on by its fingertips, rather.
The declining need for hop poles meant the loss of another link in the landscape cycle. They were one of the products of the chestnut plantations of Kent. Sweet chestnut was brought here by the Romans and for centuries has been managed as coppice. The trees are cut down to their base every few years and allowed to grow a sheaf of straight new poles. It's odd how thoroughly we've forgotten that all our native trees will regenerate in this way when they're cut down. In fact, they'll do so indefinitely, forming huge live stumps, often centuries old. The pole's chief use for the last 2 centuries has been in the making of cleft chestnut fencing. Hop poles were next, at least in Kent. Every part of the cut wood was used.
The lop and top, you know, you cut the chestnut down and then you chop the sort of twiggy part off at the top. That's burnt these days, but in those days it was tied up into what we call faggots, you know, bundles of twigs.
50 years ago, a lot more would have been used for fuel. And although I never really got into faggots myself, I know my father used to say that he used to make 8 different types of faggots. The only one I can remember was a baker's faggot that used to be 8 foot long and used to have one piece of wood that was 4 inches across in it. But the only ones I ever made were the faggots that we used to make for the hop pickers, what we called hopper's brish. I must be one of the last of the wood reeves in the country. The wood reeve is really a hangover from sort of medieval times when instead of mayors in towns you had town reeves, and I imagine you had wood reeves at the same time. It's a name that's really carried on with the coppice trade, and it's really been the man who's in charge of the management of coppice of one sort or the other.
Dad hauled timbers, he was a wood reef, and I rode on the old timber tugs. Very uncomfortable because they're a skeletal sort of wagon. In the end of summer, then you've got the charcoal burners. They collected cordwood, which was about the length of your arm, and then they built it round in a huge circle, covered it all over with clay and turfs, except for a bit in the top. They put hot burning charcoal down in that, and once it started flaring, it would all be covered up. They used to have a little hut down there, and they would watch this day and night, and I think they had it burning for about a week, 10 days before it was opened up, and the charcoal was then used for the hop drying.
The needs of hop drying led to the evolution of a building absolutely characteristic of the Kent landscape, the oast house. The conditions inside the houses were so soporific from the heat and hop fumes that workers often used to fall asleep on the job.
The way we're using this wood here, it's really beneficial to wildlife because it is cropped on a 15-year basis. So we crop an area, the light gets into the floor of the woodland, bramble develops and various woodland flowers which are good for the butterflies, one thing or another. For the first 5 or 6 years until the chestnut gets high enough for the canopy to close over and cut out the ground cover, it's absolutely great for chiff-chaffs, willow warblers, blackcaps and hopefully nightingales.
You could call nightingales another one of the fruits of Kent. They're declining right across England, but there are still more here than in any other English county. I once heard 15 singing at once in a wood near the Medway. And I still find something poetic in the great Kent-wide Nightingale Survey of 1970, when in a long vigil between midnight and dawn on the 24th of May, 167 listeners logged 977 singing birds. The woods of Kent have suffered the least change of any of the county's habitats. The badger, another creature of the woodland night, is actually increasing. But for the orchards, as for so much else in the village landscape, it's a time of violent change.
It appears that the very heart of Kent is being grubbed up. I think, in all honesty, the very heart of the hop-growing part of Kent is being grubbed up and is gone. But the fruit growing, it always appears worse than it is, and it isn't actually quite as bad. There is a lot of fruit come out, I agree, but a lot of it probably needed to come out.
The common market, because there's a structural surplus of fruit throughout Europe, have brought in a very generous grubbing grant in the hope that the French and many of the continental countries would grub their fruit, the Italians particularly. In fact, the biggest grubbing that's gone on has been in this country, which is very sad.
Because fruit farming has become on the borderline with profitability, some orchards are being grubbed out ahead of their time, and so you're seeing very young orchards being grubbed. That is the sad part.
But maybe this is too defeatist. There's a great national hunger for old fruit varieties, for any variety for that matter, old or new. And I reckon that it ought not to be beyond the wit of fruit growers, with their traditional canniness and new technology, to meet this. This could be the other side of village change, the opening up of new local markets, the return to village economies that don't hang on the coattails of the ministry. It's happening with charcoal burning too. As the demand from the hop kilns fades, so that for domestic barbecues rises.
We're attempting to bring about a resurgence in the charcoal industry, and hopefully we shall start using some of our coppice woodland for what it was planted for several hundred years ago.
I can remember my father coming home when I was a really small boy. He'd be having his dinner, my mother put his dinner in front of him. He'd just wash his hands and he'd sit down there, black like an Indian working clothes, no pithead bars, he'd be black like an. And he'd be eating his dinner and he'd be falling, you see, he'd be falling, I can recollect it quite plainly, like, he'd be falling asleep eating his dinner. Give his all, like, and the part of this that really sticks in me, like, not because we were running in luxury, 2 cars, TV, nothing like that, but we were still in debt. We was a family running in debt. And my father working that hard, like, it didn't seem right to some of me, like,
Thousands upon thousands of people came to these valleys for work. And when things turned bad, the sheer weight of numbers made the going even tougher, and the struggle to survive even greater. I can remember men coming up here to these tips with sacks and boxes to grub around looking for coal in the years of the Great Depression of the 1930s. They were desperate men because unless they managed to scavenge coal in this way, then they had no fire in the grate. And that was the only source of heat, both for warmth and for cooking. It was perhaps the same desperation when work was there that enabled them to tolerate such appalling and dangerous working conditions.
Well, men work in the pit. When they come up the pit, they want something to do naturally. And I don't suppose they think to themselves that it's good to be out in the fresh air after being down in the pit, you know. But that is the effect. They can come up here and sit and enjoy the sunshine. But the bird itself, I think that's the biggest thing, you know. Once you get interested in pigeons, breed them, see them coming back of their own free will, tremendous feeling, you know. And when a man look at a pigeon, seeing what is the result of his work, it's, pigeon fanciers are dedicated people.
I think you would need to have spent much of your life cooped up underground, ripping your hands with the dead weight of coal, fully to understand the affection that miners feel for their pigeons. They are not just pets or tickets to a breath of fresh air. They are comrades, fellow workers, lovingly groomed, clocked in and out. And as Billy Byrne says, they can pack enough energy in 12 ounces to fly 750 miles non-stop. And that leaves you speechless.
The birds are reluctant to cross over the top of the mountain because of peregrine falcons, and they tend to work around the mountain to come in, you know. Peregrine falcons over the last decade have multiplied to such an extent that they are now overlooking pigeon fanciers' loft in urban areas. When a man let his birds out for exercise, these falcons are down and taking them away in front of their eyes, you know. When they're on their own doorstep, when you let your birds out for exercise, and a falcon will come out of the sky and take your bird in front of you, and you run there, you've seen the falcon taking the bird down and run to it, and when you got there, its chest muscles have been ripped out and the bird's still alive, you know. Bird eating it before it's dead. And that's bad enough in itself. But when that bird belonged to you, you have reared it, trained it, cared for it, and have high hopes for its sporting ability, you know. And to see that happening in front of your face is terrible.
AB-15 coal cutter doesn't sound very much, does it? But believe me, it had a fearful reputation. It was called the Widowmaker, so it speaks for itself, doesn't it? But when they brought these machines in, they brought them in about 1930s. And they were brought in as a means of improving or increasing production. And when they brought them in, almost immediately from the time they came in, they started to create an enormous dust problem. Let me show you what I mean. In a brief space of time, you'll be gone from here. You'll be going back to the surface. Now, those men worked in this atmosphere every day of every week of every year.
You go down the pit, and you're breathing in the dust. And I had to think, look back, what a fool I was. Dust was there, tremendous. Men were breathing it in, including myself, and all my brothers. And that dust had gone in your lungs and it would never come out. Up here now, you can feel the fresh air. Many people take the fresh air and breathe in as automatic. But to a man with silicosis, dust in his chest, it's a luxury.
The landscape is beginning to heal of its own accord. Areas of subsidence have filled with water and begun to take on the look of natural lakes. Self-sown trees are colonizing the spoil heaps. And back to the water and the greenery come the birds. The local joke that instead of the dawn chorus, you used to be woken up by a chorus of birds coughing, has lost its bite.
The children today have been collecting water plants from another pond in the nature reserve we have here, and they've brought them to this lake. This is the area where the fernicide once stood, the fernicide fuel works, and they're starting to plant them so they'll establish themselves and make a much more attractive bank and lower reaches of the water.
Since the fernicide works closed down and been removed, a lot of life has come back, and it really is a very interesting little nature reserve now. It has recovered. Nature does recover. If you remove a polluting source, nature's recovery is very rapid. Trees have grown. Some of these oaks around here were stag-headed, but now new twigs have come forth, and dormant buds have burst. Lots of butterflies, lots of birds. I live not very far away, and my species count is 64, I think, in my garden. Well, that's pretty good for 1 acre of land, you know?
There are new harvests in the Kent villages. Barbecue charcoal and new fruit varieties, for instance. Non-essential leisure harvests, maybe, but still deserving a place in the Thanksgiving festivals which are held throughout the countryside. They are old crops which have found new roles, reminders that the village itself, an ancient but insular institution, may also be finding a new role in the world. When local bus services were introduced, it meant that there was a way out of the village for the mass of ordinary people. But the new freedom of movement has been won at a price. The bubble of self-sufficiency has been burst. The village street is no longer a place for watching the world go by. It's a congested bottleneck on the way to somewhere else, and in Kent, quite likely part of the new gateway to the continent. The changing village could yet prove a source of new ideas about living and work. But for many of its older inhabitants, it's increasingly just a place of memories.
I walked across a field called 18 Acres with 2 friends when I was about 14 or 15. And it was in 1943, and a Spitfire came over the top and did everybody called it a victory roll, and it did something to me. The backdrop of the waving corn, the blue of the sky, and this magnificent, beautiful machine doing this over the top, and I mentally resolved that I was going to do that. In 1963, I went over the top in a chipmunk, and it was a very nostalgic thing for me because I, for the sheer hell of it, did a big barrel roll over the top of 18 Acres. And because the airplane was inverted, I looked up at the place where I used to live, and there was nothing there. It was, makes me get quite choked when I talk about this because everybody that I'd ever known or loved had all gone. The old, even the house that was in the house that I lived in was a new house. I could see the outline of the land, but there was nothing there. And every single person that I'd ever known had gone. And there was I showing off, showing everybody what I could do, and I was playing to an empty theatre. There was nothing. And I went back to Biggin Hill, feeling very, very choked indeed, and I never, ever flew over there again.
The sense of a world turned upside down is felt in the Welsh valleys too. The landscape is healing, but the memories remain.
The industrial scars are disappearing, and the greenery is evident everywhere you go, so that people who come here with the old ideas of the mining valleys as ugly places full of coal tips and bare hillsides and dirty rivers, they have quite a shock.
The maddening part about it for me is, I mean, this valley was a dirty place to live in, you know. But I mean, now they've taken our work from us, you know. I mean, the Rhondda's a lot cleaner, as you can see, you know. It's a beautiful valley, you know, as you compare with anything in Europe. But the trouble is, there's no work here.
People ask you this question when I guide. They say, how can you possibly talk nostalgically about accidents, about men with pneumoconiosis? How can you talk about the awful conditions at underground, walking 1.5 miles, 2 miles away to a place that is soaking wet, or a place where the dust is so bad it's unbelievable. But the best way that I can say it, as a miner, that when you went to work on a Monday morning after a couple of pints the night before, you know, and I used to practice in the band on a Sunday night, and we'd go and have a drink, and invariably get to bed late, but get up in the morning at 6 o'clock. But going in the bus, in the early hours of the morning, going to the pit, When you got into the canteen and when you got into the baths, and slowly then as you got into the lamp room, decked out in your working clothes, your lamp on, your helmet on, waiting to go down the pit, if you weren't laughing, there was something wrong with you.